Hey everyone, welcome to the Holy Trinity Anglican Podcast. I am your host, Father Andrew Hollingsworth. In today's episode of the Holy Trinity Anglican Podcast, we are going to be listening to one of my lectures for my Introduction to the Old Testament course. And this lecture is on the Assyrian backgrounds of the Old Testament. As we know, Assyria plays an important role in the Old Testament, and they are a particular problem for the northern kingdom of Israel in the book of Kings. But before we get into the episode, I want to ask a couple of things for you real quick. If you like this podcast and you like the content you're getting, let me encourage you to subscribe to this channel. You will learn a lot about the Old Testament, the New Testament, philosophy. We are posting all kinds of interesting content now that we weren't posting before, such as my sermons for the Church of the Holy Trinity, our lectures from our public lecture series, the Illuminate public lecture series, and more really fun stuff. If you like this video, be sure to like it, subscribe to the channel, share it with anyone you think that the content might be beneficial for. This is the podcast for kind of our education ministry of Church of the Holy Trinity and Anglican Mission, and we're calling that ministry, that education ministry, Holy Trinity Anglican Institute. And if you know someone that you think would benefit from this, that would grow in their knowledge of Scripture and help them walk better with the Lord, feel free to share it with them and send the videos to them. Or if you're listening over on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever, share the episodes with them as well. If you'd like to support this ministry, as well as just the ministry of Church of the Holy Trinity in general, I'll put a link down below to our church's giving page. The best way to support our ministry and what we're doing is to just give straight to the church. Helps support this podcast. It helps support the local missionary and evangelism work that we're doing here, the Bible studies that we host, and so much more, outreach events, if you would like to bless our church's ministry. Now, without further ado, let's jump in and learn about the Assyrian backgrounds of the Old Testament. All right. Welcome to another lecture for my Introduction to the Old Testament course. As I said, we are talking about the Assyrian backgrounds of the Old Testament. Now, if you've been keeping up with the lectures in this series or on this playlist of episodes, if you're watching over on YouTube, you'll notice I'm doing the lectures for my Intro to the Old Testament course, and we've already been doing episodes like this up to this point, where we looked at the Egyptian backgrounds to the Old Testament, the Hittite ones, the Sumerian ones, and stuff like that. And this is important because the Old Testament is not just born in a vacuum. The Old Testament doesn't just descend from heaven, an array of light written with, and its meaning is no connection to the world around it. No, yes, the Old Testament is divinely inspired by God, and the Old Testament, I believe, is God's speech. God uses the human authors to write His word, and those human authors are born in a particular historical context and a particular cultural and religious context as well. And these nations surrounding the people of Israel, who are the authors of the Old Testament, they have a tremendous influence on the people and how they view God and how they view the identity of Israel and so much more. And it helps us to make better sense of our Old Testaments. And while we've seen some of the important backgrounds from the Egyptian culture, from the Hittite worldview, and the Sumerians, the Assyrian is no less important. And as I may have said before, the Assyrian Empire particularly poses a unique problem for the northern kingdom of Israel. But we'll get to that in a minute. But to help understand the impact of the Assyrian Empire on the Old Testament, we need to first begin with a little history of the politics and geography and stuff of Assyria. Assyrian history begins in the city of Assur, which is named after their primary god, Ashur. Ashur is the ultimate supreme god in the Assyrian pantheon. He oversees all of the others. He gives the world order. He rules over all the other gods. He is the top god for the Assyrians. The city of Assur is built in the 3rd millennium BC, and it becomes an independent city-state after the collapse of the Sumerian third dynasty of Ur, which happens around 2000 BC. The primary language that is being spoken in this region, in the city of Assur, and the areas surrounding that, is Akkadian, which is one of the primary languages spoken down in Babylon as well. Now, the god Ashur personified the rocky outcrop towering over a bend of the river Tigris, where the city of Assur is located. The temple that is built atop of this crag, it was the only temple that existed in Assur for a very long time. Again, because Ashur, which is the god who, the city is named after the god Ashur, he is the supreme god, so therefore there's only one temple in Assur, and that is a temple to Ashur. Now, this isn't to say that the Assyrians don't worship other gods. They definitely do. They're definitely polytheists, and we'll talk more about that later. But there are some Assyriologists who actually want to debate that Assyrian religion may have been actually a kind of monotheism, or at least henotheism, something like that. We'll talk more about that later in the lecture. So there's multiple gods in the Assyrian worldview, but Ashur is the top dominant king god. Now, the ruler over the city of Assur, who the king, we might call him a king, he rules as a mediatorial and representative figure on behalf of the god Ashur to the people. So this is interesting because we see something similar down in Egypt. The pharaoh is considered a representative of the Egyptian gods. But what's different is that in the Egyptian worldview, the pharaoh is divine. It's almost kind of like an incarnate god, the way the god is thought to, the Egyptian god is thought to rest or dwell in the pharaoh. If you want more clarity on that, you can go back and watch our video on the Egyptian backgrounds to the Old Testament. But that's not quite how it is in Assyria. The king is a representative of the god Ashur to the people, but he is not himself divine. And also, the king is not the only ruler over the people. The ruler works with an appointed official who is elected by a city assembly from Assur, and this representative, this figure who's elected, is referred to as a limam. And what's interesting is that though the ruler, the king of the city, is kind of the more authoritative figure who mediates the rule of the god to the people, of Ashur to the people, it's the limam in his rule that's used to provide the important dates on the Assyrian calendar. Now, the heartland of Assyria was made up of three major cities. There's Assur, Nineveh, and Arbela. And these three form a triangle, which kind of set a broad idea of where the nation of Assyria was located and the extent of the Assyrian worldview, politics, and rule. Now, as the nation of Assyria expands, they assimilate new peoples, languages, and cultures into their region, into their nation. These people who get assimilated into this Assyrian nation, or get assimilated to this region of Ashur, if we will, they get referred to as Assyrians, and they get referred to this based on their contribution to the worship of Ashur. As these people are assimilated in to the city of Assur and the rule that it has over this region or this territory in Mesopotamia, the people become Assyrians, get referred to as Assyrians, specifically because of the worship that they are going to start giving to the god Ashur. Now, to help you see where Assyria is, if you look at a map of the ancient Near East, over in modern-day Iraq, you have Babylon. Then just north of them, you've got Sumeria. And then kind of northwest of them, you have this region that gets known as Assyria. But if you go to the west of Assyria, you're going to run into the Arameans as well. If you keep going west, you'll run into the Ugaritic, and you will run into the Phoenicians. South of them, also in the area, you'll have Syria. South of there, you'll run into Israel. And then south of Israel, you run into Egypt. So if you're picturing all of this, Assyria has almost a kind of, they and the Arameans have kind of a central location on the northern region of Mesopotamia. And it's because of this. So if you're wanting to transport goods in the ancient Near East, say you're in Babylon and you're trying to get goods over to Egypt, you can't just cross the desert. You'll die before you get to the other side. Instead, you're going to follow, the trade routes follow the rivers Tigris and the rivers Euphrates, which go to the northern region of Mesopotamia. So if you're down here in Babylon, you're going to come up, you're going to come over through Assyria and Aramea, and then come down through Israel, maybe Phoenicia, and come down to Egypt that way. So if you're wanting to get to Egypt, you've got to go through Assyria and Aramea. And so these two areas up here on the northern part of Mesopotamia, they're part of that important trade route. And because of that, these different nations are going to be fighting for who's in control of this. Because if you control that area, you can charge more taxes, tariffs, and stuff like that on the transport of goods. You can, it's a strategic military location as well. And so Assyria is constantly fighting over this region for their own rule and reign, to stay as a nation, to not be conquered by others. And in particular, they are fighting with the Arameans over this. The Arameans would regularly try and come against and overcome and collapse Assyrian cities. And this goes on back and forth between the Assyrians and the Arameans for a very long time. Now, there are two Assyrian kings in particular who are able to establish what will become the foundation for the Assyrian Empire in the first century millennium, or the first millennium BC. Not first century, the first millennium BC. They're not the ones who established the empire, but they are the ones that, as they continue to war with the Arameans, they lay the groundwork for what will become the Assyrian Empire. These two kings are Ashur-dan II, who rules from 934 to 912 BC, and the second is Adad-nirari II, who he rules from, I guess, around 912 or 911 up to 827 BC. Now, he is a very significant king, because he is the one, as he is warring with the Arameans, he is the one who is able to cross the Euphrates successfully and take for himself a major victory against the Arameans in 899 BC. Now, these two kings and that crossing of the Euphrates for a major victory against the Arameans, that lays the foundation for what will become the Assyrian Empire. But the Assyrian Empire really gets laid by the king Tiglath-Pileser III. He is an 8th century king over Assyria, and he is the one who deals the final death blow, if you will, to the Arameans, and he establishes the Assyrian Empire. Tiglath-Pileser is also significant because not only does he conquer the Arameans and expand the Assyrian Empire more westward, but he also goes down and is able to overcome and defeat Sumerians as well as the Babylonians. And he actually crowns himself the king of Babylon. Tiglath-Pileser you'll see him brought up into the Old Testament where he comes against the northern kingdom of Israel. He is mentioned several times in the book of Kings and in the prophets. He is a very successful emperor over the Assyrian Empire, and he does expand the Assyrian Empire to a very large and great extent. And as he's pushing the empire further westward, he establishes what gets known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and as he's expanding and growing the empire and conquering these different peoples, he begins a unique practice of not just merely assimilating the people into the Assyrian Empire, but kidnapping them and redistributing these conquered populations throughout the Assyrian Empire. Now, he does this because he wants to redistribute the people as he thinks will serve best Assyria's interest. And also, if you take the people out of their lands, you destabilize them, you scatter them out to where they can't get together and collude with one another, you don't have to worry about rebellions as much coming up against you from within. You scatter them, you weaken them, and they become part of Assyria. Also under Tiglath-Pileser's reign, the city of Calhu becomes the center of the Assyrian Empire. It's no longer the city of Ashur, but now it is Calhu. What's interesting about this relocation of the conquered peoples, though, as we're going to see, is this is one of the things that leads to the demise of the Assyrian Empire. It's not the thing, but it's one of the major things that is going to weaken the Assyrian nation and that is going to allow the Babylonians to become strong and to defeat them. As I said, Tiglath-Pileser moves the city capital to Calhu, and it remained the center of Assyrian political life all the way up until the reign of Sargon II. And he makes, you're going to have to forgive me on my pronunciation, I struggle with this one a little bit, he makes Dor-Sarikon his capital in 706 BC, and that happens again under the Assyrian king Sargon II. Now, as the empire is continuing to grow and they are kidnapping and relocating these peoples, the Assyrians become very famous for being especially brutal in how they defeat and conquer the people. They wouldn't just kill the men, they would also kill women and children. They would burn down temples and stuff like that. And again, it's particularly brutal to kidnap people and take them away from their homes and scatter them out to separate families the way that the Assyrians did. We actually have an archaeological inscription left behind by King Sargon II, and he knew of how brutal he was in his own conquests, and he bragged about it. Here's an inscription he left that we have access to. Sargon says, "I left behind a terror never to be forgotten." So the Assyrians weren't just famous for their brutal tactics for kidnapping, destroying, and collapsing civilizations, redistributing them to grow the empire, but they were proud of it. And they thought that this was actually a good representation and reflection of the god Ashur as well as the Assyrian gods. Like I said, ironically, it's a serious practice of relocating these conquered peoples throughout the Assyrian Empire or the Neo-Assyrian Empire that is going to be one of the chief causes for their ultimate demise. Because what Assyria does not do is they don't force a full-on assimilation into Assyrian culture. When they conquered the Arameans, they allowed them to continue speaking their language, worshiping their gods. When they did this, the same with the Babylonians, they allowed them to keep speaking Akkadian. They allowed them to keep their creation myths, to keep worshiping their gods. They had to give some kind of lip service to Ashur, of course, and serve the king of the Assyrian Empire. But they were, for the most part, allowed to still be Babylonians, though they may have been redistributed throughout the empire, though the Arameans and the Israelites may have been redistributed throughout the empire. They get to keep worshiping their gods and speaking their languages. Now, what happens is when you start assimilating all of these vastly different cultures and religions into your nation, into your empire, even though you want it to serve your empire's interest, what you're doing is you're actually weakening the morale and the excitement and the commitment to the Assyrian way, if you will. It's we might call this a kind of a form of a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? I've got the word written down. What is that word? It might represent a kind of primitive. That's what we're looking for. Primitive. It might create a kind of primitive globalism of sorts. See, had they forced the people to learn Akkadian, had they forced them to learn or to acknowledge to get rid of their religions and to worship Ashur and the Assyrian gods alone, to give their ultimate allegiances to the Assyrian way of life, things may have been different. But we see a weakening because of this in what we might call this a weakening of Assyrian nationalism and a kind of primitive globalism in its exchange. But what happens is this ends up weakening the nation, because now you've got all these different cultures and languages. Some of the people are having influences in politics and local politics and stuff like that. They're in the militaries, and it weakens. It weakens Assyrian morale. It weakens the excitement about the Assyrian Empire. First off, a lot of people aren't very happy to be there to begin with because they were conquered and kidnapped. But when you allow them to hang on to their languages and their gods and their religions, they're not going. That's just that much more. They're not going to be giving tribute, giving allegiance to the Assyrian way or the Assyrian nation. And so this leads to a severe weakening of the Assyrian Empire and a kind of destabilization of the empire. As I mentioned before, the primary language of the Assyrian Empire, or the Assyrian, of the city of Assur at least, and of the Assyrian region in the nation, the primary language was Akkadian. But by the first millennium BC, Aramaic had now become the primary language spoken in the Assyrian Empire. And then one of the things that happens as well that continues to weaken the Assyrian Empire is they keep moving the capital all over. When you move a capital, you're not just saying, okay, this is the capital and the king moves. Well, now you're having to move armies and military. Cities weren't as strong as they once were. You have to move other political figures and their families. You remove some of the wealthier people, some of the elite culture from cities. And when you do this does have a kind of destabilizing effect, and it impacts the culture of your nation. And we've already seen that when Tiglath-Pileser becomes the king of the Assyrian Empire, he moved the capital from Assur to Kalhu. And then when Sargon II becomes the king, he moves the capital to Dor-Sarukhan. And now when we get this next king in, and you're going to have to forgive me for mispronouncing this one because I'm almost certainly going to mispronounce it. This next king that we get, whose name is, I lost my notes here. Ashur Ashurnasirpal II, he expands the empire a little more than what Tiglath-Pileser and Sargon had done, but he moves the capital from Dur-Sarukin to Nimrud, and that becomes the administrative center for the empire. Now, this is interesting because Nimrud is not one of the major cities that made up the Assyrian nation to begin with. If you remember, the three major cities that made up the Assyrian nation were Assur, Nineveh, and Arbela. The last two capitals have been neither of those cities. Kalhu was not, Dur-Sarukin has not, and now an even less known one, Nimrud, is made the city administrative center. And when you keep moving the city administrative centers, the capitals like this, it weakens a nation. And not only does King Ashurnasirpal II move the capital to Nimrud, but he starts building temples to gods other than Ashur. Now, as I said, the Assyrian religion is polytheistic. They do worship other gods, but we do see the worship of Ashur, which was kind of central to Assyrian nationalism, or the Assyrian way, taking a bit of a back seat, because now we see other gods starting to get worshipped more than the god Ashur. They might give lip service to Ashur being the ultimate supreme god, but we see more common people starting to give worship to different Assyrian gods, such as the god Ninurta, who is one of the primary gods that Ashurnasirpal II builds a temple for in the new empire's capital in Nimrud. Ninurta is also known as the Assyrian god Nabu, and Ashurnasirpal II sees Ninurta as having a kind of order over the world and starts to give more of his allegiance to Ninurta rather than to Ashur. Now, a later king that comes after Ashurnasirpal II, a king that we are familiar with from the Old Testament in particular, Sennacherib. He is the Assyrian king who tries to overcome the nation of Judah after the kingdom of Israel split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. It is Sennacherib who comes against Jerusalem trying to sack Jerusalem and is unsuccessful. We read about this in the book of 2 Kings, and we read about this in the prophet Isaiah, about how Adonai sends his angel and kills so many Assyrians while they sleep at the walls of Jerusalem. Sennacherib is the king at this time, and he rules in the late 8th century going into the 7th century from 705 to 651 BC. And Sennacherib, like these other kings before him, moves the capital again, but this time he moves it to a more central city of the Assyrian region, which is Nineveh. And we're familiar with Nineveh from the prophet Jonah. We're familiar as well from the prophet Nahum. Now, the city of Nineveh and the Assyrian or the Neo-Assyrian Empire, they eventually fall. They get conquered by the Babylonians. Specifically, they are conquered by the Babylonians in 612 BC by the Babylonian ruler Nabopolassar. And this happens because of the way that they were distributing the peoples, relocating these peoples. As I said, this weakens the Assyrian nationalism. This weakens Assyria's own unique culture. They no longer have the same level of allegiance to the god Ashur, which was central to Assyrian nationalism. They start allowing other gods to be worshipped. They allow other people to worship their gods. They start building temples to lesser-known gods of Assyria. The culture starts to destabilize. We've seen how they've been shifting the capital over and over, and this weakens some of the political strength as well as the military strength of the Assyrians. So when you have this kind of destabilization, this decentralization of the empire, the way this has been going, you're asking for a disaster. And sure enough, this allows the Babylonians, under the leadership of Nabopolassar, to come in and conquer the Assyrians. So that's some of the political the political history and the geographical history of the Assyrian Empire that's important for helping us understand how Assyria relates to the nation of Israel and how they're going to be a player in the story of Israel in the books of the Old Testament. And just understanding that world of the Old Testament. But we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the religion of the Assyrians. Like many of the other religions of the ancient Near East, the Assyrians, as I said, they are polytheists. They do believe that there are multiple gods that exist. This isn't the same kind of belief in other divine beings that we see in Israel. Israel believes that there is a plethora of divine beings that exist, but there is only one true God, one uncreated, eternal being who enjoys the properties of aseity, omnipotence, omniscience, and that is Adonai. He is the one true God over the entire people of Israel. Now, he may have created these other quasi-divine beings. They're often referred to as angels, evil ones who have rebelled against Adonai. They are referred to as demons. Sometimes they're all called sons of God in the Old Testament. There are these quasi-divine beings that Adonai creates, and he gives them certain tasks and functions in the universe that he has made. But they're not gods. They're not to be worshipped. They do not receive worship for themselves. They're not quite the same thing that seems to be the case of the gods in Assyria, Sumeria, Babylon, and these other ancient Near Eastern religions. They don't seem to, while there's some kind of connection between angels and stuff with like the stars and stuff like that, we don't see a sun angel or a moon angel. We don't see a sea angel and stuff like that in Israel like you do in all these other nations. Assyria has that. They have a goddess of beauty. They have a god of war. They have these different kinds of gods who oversee these different things. But what makes Assyria interesting is that they believe that there is this one true God who is the father and king over all of the other gods, and that was Asher. In that sense, that there is one divine being who is the father of them all. That seems to be some kind of parallel to Israel's religion, but it's not quite the same thing because, as we're going to see, not even Asher is truly eternal, and they don't accord the same kind of authority and powers to angels that the Assyrians and others are doing with their so-called gods. But as I said, Asher is the preeminent god of the Assyrians. He becomes equated later with the Babylonian god Enlil, who is the father of Marduk. Sorry, maybe A is the father. I think A is the father of Marduk. But with the god Enlil, who is one of the major gods in the Babylonian pantheon, it's also worth noting whoever the god in charge in Babylon or Assyria, that tends to shift in different stages of these nations' histories. That's also something that's very interesting about Israel's religion, is because of their kind of monotheism that they hold to, you don't see that kind of shift amongst which gods are important, which ones are less important, stuff like that in Israel's history. Later, there are some who try to even equate Asher with the Babylonian god Marduk. This is because Marduk becomes worshipped as the king of the gods, and he takes on a more prominent role in the Babylonian world. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the Babylonian religion and the Babylonian worldview. Assyria does draw a lot, though, from the Babylonians' theology and from their own religion, though they are still distinct from the Babylonian religion. Now, in many ways, the Assyrians seem to worship the same gods as Babylon does, but they give them different names. They might give them different functions, and Asher is king at the end of the day for Assyria. It's distinct from it, but they worship the same kind of offices, divine offices, if you will, that they might appoint a god by a different name over that office. Though Asher is the top god in Assyrian religion, he doesn't really seem to have been worshipped all that much outside of the city of Asher, which is also really interesting, and which is why if Asher, the god, is supposed to be central to the culture and to the vision of the Assyrian way, and if he's only worshipped in your capital, and then you start moving that capital, and the worship of Asher is no longer as prominent, as popular, again, you're going to see that kind of weakening or destabilizing of Assyrian national identity and of Assyrian pride, if you will, in the Assyrian way. The god Nabu, who is also known as Ninurta, he seems to have been worshipped more significantly than Asher was. He's definitely even more significant than the god Marduk. By the way, the Assyrians affirm the god Marduk like the Babylonians did, though they didn't give him the same level of importance. Nabu, for example, though, is considered more significant than Marduk, which is interesting because Nabu, or Ninurta, whichever you would like to call him, is the son of Marduk. But yet it is this god Nabu, or Ninurta, who Ashurnasirpal II builds a temple to in his city capital of Nimrud. So again, we see that worship of Asher, though he's given kind of a lip service, he does take a bit of a back seat in the culture of Assyria and in the popular religion of Assyria. The Assyrians also worshipped Ishtar, who is the goddess of beauty and love. She was an important goddess for whom temples were built. And as I said, essentially, the Assyrians are worshiping many of the same gods that the Babylonians and the Sumerians would, though by different names or by giving them different functions. It's kind of like how you've probably heard this in some of your courses before, maybe you heard this in high school, that you have the Greek pantheon of like Zeus, Apollos, Hades, Hera, this Greek pantheon, but then you have also this Roman pantheon of Jupiter, of Mars, and so forth. And there's this idea between the Greeks and the Romans, oh, we worship the same gods, we just give them different names. Something similar is happening in the ancient Near East, like with how Assyria seems to be worshiping the same gods as the Babylonians, but with different names. It's kind of like that, but it's not exactly the same, because it's not only do they have different names, but sometimes they have different functions altogether. And again, the Assyrians have this one true god that they worship, Asher. Now, Asher, again, as I mentioned before, he is central to the culture and the everyday life of the Assyrians. Part of the calendar, the Assyrian calendar, revolves around festivals and feasts to Asher, and he is kind of a crux that holds a lot of that Assyrian culture together. For example, Asher, one of the main festivals on their Assyrian calendar, Asher is provided a daily feast in exchange for his favor on the Assyrian people and the Assyrian nation. Now, that's really interesting. The people will bring together and prepare a giant feast to win his favor, that he may bless them. That's not altogether unlike something we see in the Old Testament. Now, notice the Assyrians, and that would be the Day of Atonement. Now, the Day of Atonement is about the forgiveness of Israel's sins. The feast to Asher doesn't seem to have anything to do with the forgiveness of sins, but it is a kind of, hey, be merciful to us, give us your grace, O Asher, to help us flourish, to produce crops, and to be a powerful nation. It's not entirely unlike the Day of Atonement, though it's by no means the same thing either. In the Day of Atonement, the people of Israel would come, they would confess their sins, and the high priest would lay the sins of the people on the scapegoat to it, so that way Israel's sins could be forgiven, so they could continue to dwell with their God, Adonai, in his presence, and be an accurate representation of him to the world. They didn't really do it to receive his blessings, though it is a blessing to continue to have him dwell in your midst and to be his representative to the world. There's none of that, though, without the forgiveness of sins. And that's one of the major, but it is a one time of the year where they would come together. They didn't offer a meal, though they would burn. There was one sacrifice that would be slaughtered and be burned on the altar to the Lord for the forgiveness of sins. So again, this Assyrian meal is not entirely unlike the Day of Atonement in ancient Israel, but it's also a very different kind of meal. And I bring it up just to kind of help you kind of connect the dots to see how the function and the significance that this feast to Asher would have had. Assyrians, when they would expand the empire and they would conquer these people, they let those people continue worshiping their gods. Oftentimes, the Assyrians would just welcome them into their own pantheon, including idols of those gods for those conquered peoples. Not only would they welcome those gods into their pantheon, but they would sometimes place the idols of these gods in their own Assyrian temples, including the temple of Asher. And again, that's an indicator that though there is a weakening in the kind of worship of Asher that is in the popular religion of Assyria, and that goes hand in hand with the Assyrian culture and national identity, since Assyria is based off of the name of the city Assur, which is named after the god Asher. So when you start to demote Asher, if you follow that down, you start to see kind of a demotion of Assyria of sorts. Now, all of these gods that they would welcome in had to bow to Asher as the one true God and as their own divine king. As I mentioned before, some Assyriologists, because of this, debate whether or not Assyria is truly polytheistic. Yes, Assyria believed in all of these other gods, but the kind of level and authority and prominence that they gave to Asher, making him far above the other gods, it almost looks like a kind of monotheism. Again, even in the Old Testament, you've got Adonai and you've got all these other created quasi-divine beings, and he rules and is king over all of them because he alone is the uncreated, the only ultimate sovereign. You see something, it's not the same, it's not even really parallel, but maybe adjacent happening in Assyria. So while some Assyriologists want to say it's a kind of monotheism, I don't think it is. I still think it's a kind of polytheism, where they just have one God who is more powerful than the rest and is the father of them all. And the reason that's really different from what's happening in the Old Testament is because Adonai isn't just a stronger version of these other quasi-divine beings that he creates. He is categorically different and possesses a litany of properties that these created divine beings, or quasi-divine, whatever you want to call them, he possesses a whole litany of properties that they don't have. Adonai belongs just to an entirely different category than do the created divine beings, such as, the seraphim, the cherubim, and stuff like that. In the Assyrian pantheon, Asher doesn't seem to differ quite so drastically in kind or in category from the other gods as Adonai does from his created divine beings. However, I've mentioned that Assyria is polytheistic. Here's just a few of the other gods that they worshipped. There was Anu, who is the god of heaven. There was Ea, who is the god of wisdom. Sometimes Ea gets referred to as the creator. You've got Sin, who is the god of the moon. You've got Shamash, who is the sun god. You've got Marduk, who is the son of Ea. See, I knew I was mispronounced there. Marduk is not the son of Enlil. Marduk's the son of Ea. Marduk, who is the son of Ea, he's the king of the gods in Babylon, and he helps watch over cosmic order in Babylon. And he plays some kind of role in that in the Assyrian pantheon, but nothing quite like he does in the Babylonian pantheon. And he especially has no authority over Asher. Then we also have Ishtar, who is the god of beauty and of love. We have Ninurta / Nabu, who I mentioned earlier. Nabu is a warrior god. And then we have Adad, who is the god of thunder. And we have Nergal, who is the king of the earth. Now, these are not all the Assyrian gods, but these are some of the more prominent ones that we know the Assyrians were worshiping. And several of these, such as Nabu and Ishtar, we would see a more wide-ranging worship, especially in the later Assyrian Empire, Neo-Assyrian Empire. We see more popular worship of them going on than we do the worship of Ashtar. So though Ashtar is given a kind of lip service, he's the ultimate sovereign, the ultimate king of the gods, you see on the ground, though, at a more grassroots level, more worship being given to Nabu and to Ishtar. And that, again, we see being particularly the case once Ashurnasir Paul II relocates the capital of the Assyrian Empire and has a temple to Nabu / Ninurta built, and not one for Asher. Now, the Assyrian religion is also very connected to Assyrian politics. As I mentioned earlier, the king of Assyria is seen as a mediatorial representative figure, governing figure, between Asher and the people of Assyria. Assyrian religion, it was inseparable from the Assyrian politics and daily life. So as I said, the Assyrian king was Asher's representative, but unlike the Pharaoh in Egypt, as we mentioned before, he is not divine. He does not ever receive worship. Temples are never built for Assyrian kings like they are built for the Egyptian pharaohs. Nevertheless, they are the highest ruling figure between the people. And in this sense, the Assyrian king has more in common with the Israelite king. The king of Israel, for example, he is a representative figure. He rules over the people of Israel on Adonai's behalf, but he is in no way divine, and he doesn't even really receive divine authority to the same way that the king of Assyria would have had over the people. But he was a representative figure of God to the people in one sense, and he did rule over the people in Israel in a kind of similar way. But also, you have a clearly distinct role between the king of Israel and the high priest in Israel. The high priest represents the people back to God, and he has a mediatorial role as well. You don't see that to the same extent in the Assyrian Empire. Actually, it's nowhere near to the same extent, at least not as according to how Craig Bartholomew lays out in his book, The Old Testament and God. The Assyrian creation myth, at least as we have it from the Neo-Assyrian Empire, it's basically the same creation myth as we see in Babylon, which is Enuma Elish. However, the Babylonian gods are kind of swapped out for the Assyrian gods, and as always, Asher is given a prime position in that creation myth. Now, I mentioned earlier that not even Asher himself is the same kind of God as Adonai is, because there's a sense in which Asher himself isn't truly eternal. Asher kind of some of the other gods emerge out of these primordial waters that exist, that represent chaos, the sea. Something similar happens with the gods of Egypt, with the Babylonian gods. They kind of just emerge out of this primordial sea. Asher does, and then he is the father and gives birth to these other gods as well. That's not what happens with Adonai. Adonai doesn't emerge out of these primordial waters. He is already there prior to the primordial waters. He has causally, and I would even say temporally prior to the existence of those waters. And he does not emerge out of them. So Adonai is uniquely uncreated. It's what we call the property of aseity. He doesn't depend on anything outside of himself for his existence or his being. He's not created by anything else, any power outside of himself. He is of himself and from himself, self-existent, if we will. And not even Asher seems to have that kind of unique property. But he is considered the sovereign over the Assyrian gods. So in conclusion, to kind of summarize what all we've talked about in this lecture for today, we see that Assyria is a major and important background component to the world of the Old Testament, if for nothing else because Assyria is going to come against the northern kingdom of Israel and conquer her and relocate her people throughout the Assyrian Empire. Tries to, under the reign of Sennacherib, tries to overtake Jerusalem, but fails because under the rule of King Hezekiah, the people of Judah are faithful to Adonai, and Adonai is faithful to them and protects them from the sieges of the Assyrians and of Sennacherib. Israel, however, the northern kingdom of Israel does have two prophets that prophesy against Assyria that we see in the Old Testament, which is another reason Assyria is important for us, to help us better understand who Jonah and Nahum are prophesying against. You'll remember Jonah is sent to Nineveh. He doesn't want to get swallowed by the fish. Goes to Nineveh, prophesies against them, calls them to repent, and they do for a while. But then they go back to being jerks, to being to the worship of false gods, for being brutal to the Israelites, trying to conquer Judah. And then God, through the prophet Nahum, says, okay, well, I gave you a chance to repent, and you didn't. Now I'm going to destroy you. And as we know that Adonai does destroy Assyria, because he then raises up Nabopolassar of Babylon, and they are able to conquer and overthrow the Assyrian Empire and bring it to an end. As with the Egyptians, the Sumerians, and the Hittites, the Assyrians were polytheistic, though they held that Asher was the king and supreme god over all of the gods. Religious life and political life were inseparable in Assyria, as with the other ancient Near Eastern nations. Daily life and the national calendar revolved around holidays and feasts to the gods, especially to the god Asher. And the king of Assyria was seen as a mediatorial figure who mediated the rule of Asher and the gods to the people. As I said before, the king of Israel has a somewhat parallel role in doing that as well. So that's going to do it for our lecture on the Assyrian backgrounds to the Old Testament. This gives you an idea of the Assyrian worldview, some of her history, some of her religious view, how her religion is so essential to her culture and her politics, and how when we see a weakening in that religion, we see a weakening of the culture and stuff. Something that I think Christians would be mindful of today. If the Christian church starts to have a weakening in our faithfulness to Jesus, if we start weakening on that, then churches that are not faithful to Jesus, we're going to see those churches become destabilized as well, and I think they will ultimately cease to be churches. It was possibly because of their continued weakness to Asher that the Assyrians became weakened and eventually no longer were Assyrians. It's not an exact parallel, but I'm just kind of thinking out loud as I go about wrapping up this lecture. But I hope this lecture has been helpful for you. Again, if you've enjoyed this, please be sure to hit the like button down below. Subscribe to our channel if you're benefiting from this. I do this channel primarily for our church members and the people we're ministering to, but if it helps and reaches other people as well, then I hope it does, then God bless you for that. Again, if you'd like to support the ministry, not only of the podcast, but just of what we're doing at Church of the Holy Trinity as we're trying to grow the kingdom of God in St. Tammany Parish in breadth and depth, you can do that by going to our church's website and clicking on the Give page, and you can make a donation to our church there. I can link that down below for you as well if you'd like. Again, I hope this bit has been a blessing to you. In our next lecture, in our Intro to the Old Testament, we'll be talking about the Babylonian worldview and the background that provides to the Old Testament. But until then, I hope you have a blessed day, a blessed week, and I hope God will cause his face to shine on you in all that you do. The Lord be with you, and God bless.